Now, copper prices soared to an all-time high following President Trump's announcement of a 50% tariff on imports of that commodity. It's now up about 9% after jumping as much as 15% earlier in the day. Now, the major U.S. markets closed flat as traders appear to be largely shrugging off the president's latest tariff threats. Mr. Trump announced the copper tariff in a cabinet meeting earlier, where he also insisted that his deadline for sweeping reciprocal tariffs hasn't changed. Listen.
It wasn't a change. It was August 1st. We don't change very much. You know, every time we put out a statement, they say he made a change. I didn't make a change. A clarification, maybe. No, August 1st they pay.
Robert Holleyman is a former Deputy U.S. Trade Representative, and he joins me now. It is good to have you on board as we try and parse what exactly is going on with these negotiations. You know, I have compared it to having a gun to your head if you're one of these countries. And I've also said before, as I'm sure you will agree with, trade negotiations is one of the most complicated negotiations you can go through with a country, because it is kind of like chess. You have to anticipate what one move, one tariff will mean to your businesses and the actual impact it will have. Given that, these are tight deadlines. What do you think is going on here? And do you think this is a strategy that is working for the president?
Well, I think the president's done two things. One, he's exerted the ultimate level of perceived or actual executive authority to try to impose these new tariffs. Secondly, he's put out a couple of deadlines, the most recent of which is now August 1st, in an effort to try to get countries to come to the table with the U.S. on the outlines of proposed trade agreements. But what we know is that no full-fledged trade agreement is likely to be negotiated in the short amount of time that the U.S. has given. So I think at most what we're going to see are the frameworks for agreements rather than long-standing formal trade agreements.
If he gets those frameworks, though, and this works, is that successful? It's incredibly unorthodox. I can't imagine another president would have even attempted it. But what is your opinion?
Well, the president's doing two things. One is he's using an authority granted in 1977 under the International Economic Emergencies Act, which has never before been used by a president to impose tariffs. And the vast majority of what he's proposing to do is untested. And in fact, the statute doesn't even refer to tariffs, nor did the legislative history indicate Congress intended it to be given to the president for tariff authority. So this is going to be playing out in the courts. Already it is being played out. And my guess is that the Supreme Court will likely rule on this, but it won't be for another 6 to 12 months. So the president's using the perceived authority that he has to try to negotiate these agreements. The second part is he's negotiating agreements that he will never present to Congress. So they're good for the duration of his tenure in office. They can be changed at his will. They can be upped or reduced in tariffs at his discretion. But Congress, which has the constitutional authority over foreign commerce, is largely being kept at bay and kept out of the picture so the president can do this through executive authority.
Right, but in terms of if it will work, right? He wants a better deal. We already know that apparently Europe might have a better deal for the president. At least that's what the Commerce Secretary thinks. What are your predictions here?
Well, I think we are going to get some progress in this. Clearly, this is an incentive for countries to come to the table with something for the U.S. And anything that we get that improves the status quo is helpful. But what it's not going to do is it's not going to be lasting agreements. The agreements may not get to the most sensitive areas where the U.S. has real difficulties accessing foreign markets. And finally, the big disruptor in all this is China, whose predatory practices and unfair market practices around trade have had largely distorting effects for the U.S. and countries around the world. None of this ultimately gets at the China challenge, although the president is trying to address that around the margins, but it actually has the risk of further dividing the U.S. and our allies when we need to deal with some of the very real disruptions in trade that are caused by China's state-led economy.
You know, the American economy has been quite resilient. In fact, so has the global economy through all of this. Do you predict that will continue, or do you think economies will really start to buckle, including the United States? Because what you're telling me is that there will still be so much more uncertainty to follow, given this is unorthodox.
Well, what we're doing is we're building in place until the courts or the Supreme Court finally decides a series of higher taxes on imported goods into the United States. President Trump is hoping that that will generate a lot of revenue for the U.S. Treasury, which it probably will. Secondly, it's hoping that it will generate more companies to come and invest and build in the United States. The jury's still out on that. And third is his hope that it won't yield to higher prices for U.S. consumers. And it's unlikely that that result will happen. We will see those higher prices. So the question is, at the end of the day, do we win more than we lose? And the jury is very much still out on that. And countries are watching what happens in the United States for both what happens in the short term with these immediate negotiations, but also in the medium term in terms of whether or not the tariffs that the president has threatened to impose will actually be upheld by the courts. And again, I think that's at best a 50-50 proposition, because it's pretty clear from the congressional history that the statute that the president is primarily relying upon was never intended by Congress to be used to grant tariff authority to the president.
Yeah, and it's interesting that even, you know, the countries that Donald Trump is negotiating with, they're not looking for remedy to the courts either. They believe that perhaps it'll come too late, as you point out. We will leave it there for now. Grateful to you. Appreciate it.